There is a dynasty that lasted 118 years and changed everything. Not in the way that history tends to use that phrase, as a loose approximation of significance, a shorthand for things that mattered somewhat more than other things. In the most literal and most specific sense. The dynasty that ruled England from 1485 to 1603 changed the religion of a nation, changed the relationship between the individual and the state, changed the role of the monarch in a constitutional system that was still being invented, changed the position of England in the European and eventually the global order, changed the nature of Parliament, changed the nature of the Church, changed the nature of marriage as a legal and theological institution, and set in motion a series of consequences that are still visible in the structure of the modern world 5 centuries after the last of them died in a palace in Richmond without an heir and without having told anyone who should succeed her. The Tudors were 5 monarchs across 4 generations. Henry VII, who took the throne at Bosworth Field in 1485 by killing the last Plantagenet king in battle, and who spent the rest of his reign making sure nobody could take it from him the same way. Henry VIII, his son, who began his reign as the golden Renaissance prince that every court in Europe admired and ended it as the most feared monarch in English history, having executed 2 wives, broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and remade the Church of England in his own image in pursuit of a male heir that cost more in human lives and institutional destruction than any other succession crisis in the history of the English crown. Edward VI, Henry's son, the boy king who died at 15, having presided over a Protestant Reformation more radical than his father had intended or his country was ready for. Mary I, Henry's elder daughter, who reversed everything her brother had done, restored Catholicism, burned nearly 300 Protestants, and died without the child that would have secured the Catholic succession she had sacrificed everything to restore. And Elizabeth I, Mary's half-sister and Henry's younger daughter, who inherited a kingdom that had been through 4 religious settlements in 12 years and who ruled it for 45 years with a combination of political genius, personal charisma, and a calculated ambiguity about her own intentions that her ministers found maddening and her enemies found impossible to defeat. 5 monarchs. 118 years. And a transformation so complete that the England of 1603 was not recognizably the same country as the England of 1485 in any institutional, religious, political, or cultural sense. The Tudors did not just rule England. They invented it. The England that sent ships around the world, that produced Shakespeare and Marlowe and the King James Bible, that developed the parliamentary traditions that would eventually produce constitutional democracy, that established the Church of England that still exists today, that built the administrative and legal structures that subsequent centuries would develop into the modern state, that England was a Tudor creation. It did not exist before them. It could not have existed without them. And the specific way it came into existence, through the specific decisions and the specific obsessions and the specific cruelties and the specific genius of 5 very different monarchs across 4 generations, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the modern world. It begins not with Henry VIII and his wives, though that is where popular imagination tends to locate it, and not even with Henry VII and Bosworth Field, though that is where the dynasty formally begins. It begins with a question about legitimacy, about what makes a ruler the rightful ruler, about whether the right to govern comes from birth, from military victory, from divine sanction, or from some combination of all 3 that the specific circumstances of 15th century England had left dangerously unclear. The Wars of the Roses, the series of dynastic conflicts between the houses of York and Lancaster that had convulsed England for the 3 decades before Bosworth Field, had not been resolved by the time Henry Tudor won the crown in 1485. They had been temporarily interrupted. The questions they had raised about legitimate succession, about the relationship between royal blood and royal right, about the capacity of Parliament to settle a disputed succession and the capacity of military force to override Parliament's settlement, had not been answered. They had been suspended, at the point of a sword, by a young man from Wales whose claim to the English throne was sufficiently tenuous that the lawyers he employed to construct it had to work very hard indeed to make it hold together. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne rested on a combination of Lancastrian descent through his mother Margaret Beaufort, who was herself descended from John of Gaunt through a line that had been explicitly excluded from the succession by an Act of Parliament, and the simple fact that he had won at Bosworth and Richard III was dead. In the political culture of the 15th century, the second element of this claim was considerably more powerful than the first. God, it was understood, declared his preference for candidates through the outcome of battle. Henry had won. Richard had lost. The theological conclusion was available to be drawn by anyone who needed a theological justification for the political reality that the battle had created. But Henry VII was too intelligent to rely on theological conclusions that his enemies could challenge with their own theological conclusions drawn from different battles. He needed to build his legitimacy on firmer foundations than Bosworth alone. And the way he went about building those foundations reveals, in the first Tudor monarch, a political intelligence that his more celebrated son overshadowed in the historical memory, but that was, in its own way, as remarkable as anything Henry VIII achieved. The first foundation was marriage. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV and the niece of Richard III, within months of taking the throne. The marriage united the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims in the bodies of their children, making any future challenge to the Tudor succession a challenge not just to the Lancastrian line but to the combined inheritance of both houses. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York merged into the Tudor rose that became the dynasty's most enduring symbol, a piece of political branding so effective that it is still instantly recognizable 5 centuries later. The second foundation was finance. Henry VII understood that a king without money was a king without power, and that the financial weakness of the crown had been a primary cause of the instability that had produced the Wars of the Roses. He spent his entire reign rebuilding the royal finances with a methodical attention to revenue, expenditure, and the control of potential rivals' financial resources that his contemporaries found excessively grasping and that historians have recognized as the foundation of the stable monarchy that his son inherited. He did not fight expensive wars. He did not make extravagant grants to favorites. He watched every penny with the specific anxiety of a man who had spent his youth in exile and poverty and who understood, in a way that men born to wealth rarely do, that money was the difference between having power and losing it. The third foundation was law. Henry VII used the legal system, and specifically the Court of Star Chamber, with a ruthlessness that suppressed the armed retinues of the great nobles whose private armies had been the instruments of the dynastic conflicts of the previous decades. The practice of livery and maintenance, by which great nobles maintained armed followings and used them to intimidate courts and override legal process, was attacked through prosecutions that made clear to the English nobility that the new king intended to be the only person in England with an army. This was not simply a legal reform. It was a fundamental statement about the nature of royal power and its relationship to the power of the nobility, a statement that the Tudors would develop and elaborate through the following century into something that began to look, from certain angles, like the early architecture of the modern state. Henry VII died in 1509, having reigned for 24 years, having survived every challenge to his throne, having made England solvent, having made it peaceful, and having produced the male heir whose existence made the succession seem, for the first time in a generation, secure. The heir was 18 years old, educated, athletic, musical, intellectually curious, and possessed of a physical presence and a personal charm that dazzled everyone who encountered him. He was everything that his careful, cautious, financially obsessive father had not been. And he was going to take everything his father had built and use it in ways that Henry VII, watching from wherever careful and financially obsessive kings go when they die, would almost certainly not have approved of. His name was Henry. He was the 8th of that name to sit on the English throne. And the story of what he did with the kingdom his father left him is one of the most extraordinary, most destructive, and most consequential stories in the history of the English-speaking world. It begins, as so many of the most consequential stories do, with a marriage. And it ends, as this particular marriage was always going to end, with the most dramatic institutional rupture in the history of Western Christendom since the Great Schism of 1054. It ends, in other words, with the moment Henry VIII decided that the Pope was wrong, that he himself was right, and that the difference of opinion was sufficiently important to justify breaking the English Church away from Rome, dissolving the monasteries, executing those who disagreed, and remaking the religious landscape of England in a form that would never fully return to what it had been before. All of it, every bit of it, because a Spanish princess had not given him a son. Catherine of Aragon had given Henry VIII one surviving child. A daughter, Mary, born in 1516, healthy and intelligent and entirely the wrong sex for a king who had watched his father's dynasty nearly destroyed by disputed succession and who understood, with a clarity sharpened by everything he had inherited and everything he stood to lose, that a daughter was not sufficient. Not because daughters were incapable of ruling, though the political culture of the period gave him every reason to believe they were, but because a daughter's claim to the throne would be disputed in a way that a son's would not, because a daughter's succession meant a foreign husband and a foreign king consort and the absorption of England into whatever European dynastic system that husband represented, and because Henry had spent his entire reign watching the fragility of dynasties built on insufficient heirs and had no intention of leaving his own dynasty in the same position. Catherine had been pregnant multiple times. The children had not survived. A son born in 1511 had lived 52 days. Other pregnancies had ended in stillbirths and miscarriages whose cumulative weight had aged the queen visibly and had begun, by the mid-1520s, to harden in Henry's mind into a theological question. Was God withholding a living son because the marriage was invalid? Was the marriage to his brother's widow, contracted with a papal dispensation that Henry had never questioned when the marriage was politically convenient, actually prohibited by divine law in a way that no papal dispensation could override? The book of Leviticus said that a man who married his brother's widow would die childless. Henry was not childless, but he was sonless, which in the dynastic mathematics of the 16th century amounted to very nearly the same thing. The theological argument was available. Henry's need for it was acute, and his conviction, which grew over the years of the annulment proceedings from a politically convenient theological position into a genuine article of personal faith, that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God was the engine that drove everything that followed. The annulment proceedings began in 1527. They should, under normal circumstances, have been straightforward. Papal annulments of royal marriages were not unprecedented. The grounds Henry was asserting, that the original dispensation for the marriage had been improperly granted, were legally complex but not inherently insuperable. The problem was Catherine herself, who refused to accept the annulment and whose nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who at the precise moment when Henry needed the Pope to be maximally accommodating to English royal wishes had his troops occupying Rome and the Pope effectively under his control. Clement VII, trapped between his imperial captor and the English king, did what trapped men in impossible political situations usually do. He delayed. He referred the matter to committees. He found procedural objections. He expressed sympathy for Henry's position and did absolutely nothing to advance it. He delayed for 6 years, and in 6 years Henry's patience, which had never been his most prominent virtue, expired completely. And Boleyn was the catalyst and the complication. Henry had fallen in love with her, or into whatever the Tudor royal equivalent of love was, sometime around 1526, and his desire for her, combined with her refusal to become his mistress rather than his wife, had given the annulment proceedings an urgency that was simultaneously personal and dynastic, and was not merely the object of Henry's desire. She was the embodiment of his hope for a son. She was young, she was fertile, she was Protestant in her sympathies in a way that aligned with the reformist theological currents that were beginning to flow from the continent, and she was absolutely unwilling to accept anything less than the Queen's crown as the price of her compliance. The combination of Henry's desire and Anne's ambition and Catherine's refusal and the Pope's paralysis produced, over 6 years of increasingly frustrated negotiation, the break with Rome that none of the parties involved had originally intended and that all of them, by 1533, could no longer avoid. Thomas Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1532 in part because Henry understood that he would grant the annulment that Warham his predecessor had refused, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void in May 1533. Henry had already married Anne Boleyn secretly in January of that year, when it became clear that she was pregnant and that the child needed to be born legitimate. The child was born in September 1533. It was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth. And Henry's response to the birth of another daughter, when he had destroyed his marriage, broken with Rome, and separated the English Church from the authority of the papacy to get a son, was one of the most consequential expressions of personal disappointment in the history of the modern world. Not because of what Henry felt, though what Henry felt was visible to everyone around him, but because of what he did next, and what he did next, and what he did next after that. The break with Rome that the annulment required was formalized through a series of parliamentary acts between 1532 and 1534 that collectively constitute the English Reformation as a legal event. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 declared Henry VIII to be the supreme head of the Church of England, transferring the ecclesiastical authority that had previously resided in Rome to the English crown. This was not merely a jurisdictional change. It was a theological revolution. The claim that the English monarch was the supreme head of the English Church was a claim that had no precedent in the 2,000-year history of Christian governance and that required, for its acceptance, a complete reconception of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority that the medieval church had spent centuries defining in terms that made exactly this kind of royal claim impossible. Thomas More, Henry's Lord Chancellor and the most distinguished legal mind in England, could not accept it. His refusal cost him his head in 1535, after 15 months in the Tower of London, in an execution that shocked the courts of Europe and demonstrated that Henry VIII's break with Rome was not a jurisdictional adjustment but a fundamental reordering of the relationship between the English state and every authority outside it. More died, as he said at his execution, "The king's good servant but God's first." It was the most concise possible statement of the principle that Henry was destroying, the principle that there existed an authority above the king to which the king's subjects owed a loyalty that the king could not override. The dissolution of the monasteries, which followed the break with Rome between 1536 and 1541, was the economic engine of the English Reformation. The monasteries owned approximately a quarter of all the land in England. Their dissolution transferred that land to the crown, which then sold or granted most of it to the English gentry and nobility, creating a class of landowners whose prosperity depended on the Protestant settlement and who therefore had a material stake in ensuring that the Catholic Church never recovered its position in England. This was the most consequential long-term consequence of Henry's break with Rome, more consequential than the theological changes and more consequential than the jurisdictional rearrangements. It created a social and economic interest group whose existence made the Catholic Restoration that Mary I attempted not just politically difficult but economically impossible, because restoring the monasteries would have required dispossessing the families who had bought the monastic lands and whose descendants still held them. And Boleyn did not survive to see the consequences of the revolution she had helped to produce. She gave Henry one more pregnancy that ended in a stillbirth, and by 1536 Henry had transferred his affections to Jane Seymour and his need for an annulment to Thomas Cromwell, who manufactured the evidence of adultery and treason that sent her to the Tower and then to the block in May 1536. The charges against her were almost certainly false. The evidence was produced under torture from men who had the specific motivation to say whatever Cromwell needed them to say to make the case that Henry needed made, and was executed on the 19th of May, 1536, 11 days before Henry married Jane Seymour. She was approximately 35 years old. She had been queen for 3 years. She left behind a daughter who would become the greatest monarch of the Tudor dynasty and arguably of any dynasty in the history of the English-speaking world. Jane Seymour gave Henry what Catherine Anne had not. A son, Edward, born in October 1537, was healthy and survived infancy, and Jane Seymour died 12 days after his birth from complications of the delivery in a piece of dynastic irony so precise that it seems almost too neatly arranged by history. The son who was supposed to secure the succession had been purchased at the cost of the mother who produced him, and the king who had destroyed 2 marriages and broken with Rome and executed 2 wives and a Lord Chancellor and dissolved the monasteries in pursuit of a male heir found himself, at 46, with the son he had wanted and the grief of losing the wife he appears to have genuinely loved. Henry married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, whose marriage was dissolved after 6 months on the grounds that Henry found her physically repellent in person after having fallen in love with her portrait, a situation that says something interesting about the limitations of portraiture as a matrimonial technology. Catherine Howard, a teenager whose previous relationships provided Henry's enemies with the grounds for adultery charges that sent her to the block in 1542 when she was approximately 17 years old. And Catherine Parr, the last and the luckiest, who was intelligent enough and politically skilled enough to navigate the final years of Henry's reign without losing her head and who outlived him. Henry VIII died in January 1547, aged 55, enormously fat, his body destroyed by decades of excess and by a leg wound that had never properly healed and that had become infected in ways that the medicine of the period could not adequately treat. He had reigned for 37 years. He had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, executed 2 wives, executed Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, and produced 3 children whose successive reigns would take England through 2 more religious settlements before Elizabeth I finally achieved the Protestant stability that lasted. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most destructive monarchs in the history of the English crown. He was also, by any reasonable measure, one of the most consequential. The England he left behind was so fundamentally different from the England he had inherited that the continuity between the two was more a matter of geography and language than of institution or religion or political structure. Edward VI, the son Henry had destroyed so much to produce, reigned for 6 years and died at 15. His reign, guided first by his uncle Edward Seymour and then by John Dudley, pushed the English Reformation in a more thoroughly Protestant direction than Henry had intended, introducing the Book of Common Prayer and the 42 Articles that defined the theological position of the Church of England in terms that the Calvinist reformers of the continent would have recognized and approved. Edward himself appears to have been genuinely committed to the Protestant cause in a way that went beyond mere political compliance, a boy king whose theological convictions were more developed than his years might suggest and whose death from tuberculosis in July 1553 left the Protestant settlement. He had advanced in a position of acute vulnerability. Mary I came to the throne in 1553, the first queen regnant in English history, and immediately began the Catholic restoration that her entire adult life had been devoted to achieving. She was 37 years old, had spent most of her adult life in the humiliation of illegitimacy imposed by her father's annulment of her mother's marriage, had watched the faith she had been raised in dismantled and replaced twice in the 12 years since Henry's death, and had survived to become queen through a combination of popular support for her legitimacy and the political miscalculation of John Dudley's attempt to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne in defiance of Henry's succession. Settlement. She was not a stupid woman. She was not a cruel woman by temperament. She was a woman whose deepest convictions had been formed by the specific suffering of her childhood and whose queenship she understood entirely in terms of the religious restoration that suffering had always pointed toward. The burning of nearly 300 Protestants between 1555 and 1558, which earned her the epithet Bloody Mary that history has attached to her name ever since, was not the product of sadism. It was the product of a theological conviction, shared by every Catholic government in Europe at the time, that heresy was a crime against God and against the community of the faithful that the secular authority was obligated to suppress by whatever means were necessary. The specific means chosen, burning at the stake, was the standard method of execution for heresy across Catholic Europe and had been applied in England before Mary's reign. What distinguished Mary's burnings was not the method but the scale, the visibility, and the public reaction that the executions generated in a country where the Protestant settlement had taken deeper root in the previous 2 decades than Mary had understood when she began the Restoration. The most famous of Mary's victims was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury who had granted Henry's annulment and who had been the primary architect of the Protestant liturgy and theology of the Edwardian Church. Cranmer had initially recanted his Protestant beliefs under pressure, signing documents of submission to Rome that he hoped would save his life. When it became clear that Mary intended to burn him regardless, he made the gesture that history remembers. At the stake at Oxford in March 1556, he thrust the hand that had signed the recantations into the fire first, holding it there while it burned, saying that the unworthy hand should be punished before the rest. It was one of the most dramatic acts of public recantation in the history of the English Reformation, and it destroyed whatever public relations benefit Mary might have hoped to derive from his recantation. Cranmer died a martyr. Mary died, in November 1558, without the child that would have secured the Catholic succession, without having reversed the economic consequences of the dissolution that made the Restoration permanent, and having burned herself into the historical memory of Protestant England as the queen who had tried to drag the country back to Rome through fire. Elizabeth I inherited a kingdom that had been through 4 religious settlements in 12 years, that was financially exhausted, that was at war with France, that had lost Calais, and whose new queen's legitimacy was challenged by Catholic Europe on the grounds that her parents' marriage had been invalid and that Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, was the rightful heir. She was 25 years old. She had survived her father's court, her brother's reign, her sister's reign, and 2 periods of imprisonment in the Tower during which her life had been genuinely at risk. She had survived by being careful, by being ambiguous, by giving nothing away that she did not have to give, and by reading political situations with an accuracy that the people around her found simultaneously reassuring and unnerving. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559, which established the Protestant Church of England on terms sufficiently broad that most of the population could accept them and sufficiently firm that the Catholic restoration Mary had attempted could not easily be repeated, was the foundation of everything else Elizabeth built. It was a settlement of deliberate ambiguity, designed by Elizabeth and her chief minister William Cecil to hold together a population whose religious convictions were genuinely divided, by providing a form of worship that required outward conformity without demanding inward conviction. You were required to attend the Church of England. You were not required to believe everything it taught. The gap between required attendance and required belief was the space in which Elizabethan England's remarkable religious diversity was contained, imperfectly but sufficiently, for 45 years. The 45 years of Elizabeth's reign were the period in which the consequences of everything the earlier Tudors had done began to become visible as the outlines of a new kind of England. The monasteries were gone and their lands were in the hands of a Protestant gentry whose prosperity was structurally linked to the Protestant settlement. The break with Rome had produced not just a new church but a new conception of the English state as a sovereign entity answerable to no external authority, religious or political, in the governance of its own affairs. The Parliament that had been the instrument through which Henry VIII had legalized his religious revolution had developed, in the process, a sense of its own constitutional significance that Elizabeth found inconvenient and that her successors would find catastrophic. The Spanish Armada of 1588, which Philip II of Spain sent to restore Catholicism to England by force and which was destroyed by a combination of English seamanship, Protestant wind, and the specific military incompetence of its commanders, was the moment when the Elizabethan Protestant settlement proved its durability under the most direct external challenge it had faced. The defeat of the Armada did not make England a great power in any immediate military sense. It demonstrated that England was not going to be a subordinate province of the Catholic Habsburg system, that the Protestant settlement was sufficiently rooted to survive the most serious attempt to uproot it, and that the island nation that Henry VIII Revolution had produced was going to have to be dealt with on its own terms rather than absorbed into the continental religious and political order. Shakespeare wrote his plays during Elizabeth's reign. Drake circumnavigated the globe. The first English settlements in the Americas were attempted, unsuccessfully, at Roanoke. The foundations of what would become the British Empire were being laid, tentatively and without a clear plan, in the same period that the English language was achieving the literary heights of the Elizabethan theatre. The connection between these things is not accidental. The confident, outward-looking, self-consciously distinctive English culture of the late 16th century was the product of the specific institutional and religious transformation that the Tudor dynasty had imposed on England across the preceding century. The England that produced Shakespeare was the England that Henry VIII had made when he broke with Rome, whether Henry would have recognized or approved of what his revolution had eventually produced. Elizabeth I died in March 1603, in Richmond Palace, having refused for weeks to eat or sleep, having sat on cushions on the floor of her chamber for days rather than take to her bed, as if taking to her bed was the final concession to mortality that she intended to resist as long as possible. She was 69 years old. She had never married, a decision whose political consequences she had managed with extraordinary skill across 45 years of reign, deploying the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic instrument while ensuring that the reality never materialized in a way that would have subordinated her authority to a husband. She had never named a successor, a decision whose political consequences she had managed with equal skill by ensuring that the most plausible candidate, James VI of Scotland, understood that his prospects depended on her goodwill without ever being explicitly told that he would inherit. She died without speaking, having reportedly indicated her choice of James by raising her hand to her head in a gesture that her ministers interpreted as indicating a king. It was the last piece of deliberate ambiguity in a reign defined by it. The woman who had never given anything away she did not have to give managed, at the last, not to give away even the explicit naming of her successor. The Tudor dynasty ended with her. The crown passed to the Stuarts. The specific combination of strengths and vulnerabilities that the Tudor century had created in the English constitution, the powerful monarchy, the increasingly assertive parliament, the Protestant church, the dissolved monasteries, the new gentry, the island identity, the nascent imperial ambition, would produce, in the following century, the English Civil War, the execution of a king, the Glorious Revolution, and the constitutional settlement of 1689 that is the direct ancestor of the parliamentary democracy of the modern United Kingdom. All of it traces back to the 5 Tudors. To the careful financial architect who took the throne at Bosworth Field. To the golden prince who broke with Rome because his wife had not given him a son. To the boy king whose Protestant convictions outran his country's readiness. To the Catholic queen who burned her way toward a restoration that the economic consequences of her father's revolution had made impossible. And to the woman who held everything together for 45 years through a combination of political genius, personal courage, and the most sophisticated deployment of deliberate ambiguity in the history of English governance. They changed everything. They were 5 people. 118 years. And the world they made is still, in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not, the world we live in.